A psychiatric treatment with a history of controversy.
Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, is portrayed in movies as inhumane.
You may have heard it called electroshock therapy, but coming from someone who's looking to help break the stigma surrounding this mental health treatment, modern ECT is purposefully peaceful.
It's not torture like so many movies depict.
It has a dark history of misuse, a litany of ethical concerns, and well-documented severe side effects. But in the modern world, is this still fair for electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT?
ECT is not only effective, it's one of the safest treatments in all of medicine.
I experience visual and auditory hallucinations during episodes, and that can be scary, but through ECT, through therapy, and through medication, I've started to control my hallucinations.
The results have been literally life-changing.
But breaking the stigma for this mental health treatment isn't easy. In fact, for some, it simply can't be broken.
When somebody's putting electric current through your brain, they're not actually 100% sure we know how complex the brain is. I have no memory of a year of my life at all.
So it really affected my short-term memory, and to this day I still have some problems with short-term memory.
ECT destroys lives. It erases precious memories. It obliterates years of education, ends careers, and cripples one's ability to learn and adapt, effectively trapping survivors in dependence and poverty.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, ECT. The modern version. It follows a podcast I did late last year when I talked to the CEO of the Mental Health Foundation, Sean Robinson, about changes proposed for the Mental Health Act. He was blunt about what he called brutal acts and treatment, which included electroshock therapy. Here's a snippet of that podcast.
I would say it kind of supports a system where we effectively criminalise people who are very unwell and then subject them to quite brutal acts. It allows things like electroshock therapy. Well, electroshock therapy is essentially using low levels of electric shocks to try and change, I'm not a physician, so, to try and change the kind of brain waves and I guess break cycles of mental distress. It is still seen as a legitimate treatment, but, clearly it's pretty extreme.
For that podcast, we approached 4 specialists to be interviewed about ECT, but all declined for various and valid reasons. Afterwards, we got some angry feedback from people in the mental health arena saying basically we were repeating old tropes. So today on The Detail, a specialist has agreed to talk to us about the benefits and side effects of ECT and the stigma of working in this area.
My name is Hiran Tharbru, and I'm the New Zealand chair of the College of Psychiatrists. So I'm a child psychiatrist and paediatrician, as well as a senior lecturer at Auckland University.
He is also trained in administering ECT. More on his honest initial reaction to that later. But first, why he agreed to this interview when others wouldn't or couldn't. Is there a reluctance, do you think, to talk about this topic?
Yes. I think certainly within our profession, we're aware about the stigma about this, and it's a challenge for psychiatrists, I guess, because we know that we come into the job to help people. We know we've got a limited number of things we can do to help people, this being one of them. And so when it's something that we're trained in with good intention and that we try and do in a safe way and only in a way that's kind of, helpful for people, it's difficult, I guess, to be perceived as the person doing something bad or harmful to other people. So a lot of my colleagues I know might be reluctant to talk about this topic, but I also know they would be supportive of it being done for the right people in the right way.
Well, we certainly appreciate you coming on and talking about this because it's important. Were you nervous or did think twice about it or fear any sort of backlash about talking about such a sort of controversial topic?
There might be some backlash, and if that's the case, that's okay. I mean, I guess I am the New Zealand chair of the college, and so I do represent kind of, our profession. And I do believe that we do need to speak up and converse about this openly as psychiatrists rather than avoiding the conversation, because we know why we're doing this, but we also have a right to explain ourselves to other people, not just to assume that they should listen to us.
Now, obviously, we want to talk all things today about ECT. And I want to start off with Dr. Haran. Is ECT as bad as most people assume or believe?
No, it's not. I mean, there is a lot of stigma around ECT, but ECT is a very effective and safe medical procedure that involves the delivery of small pulsed electrical current to the brain that's sufficient to induce a seizure for therapeutic purposes.
Who's a candidate then for ECT?
So ECT is mainly used to treat people who might have severe depression and less frequently mania, which is part of bipolar disorder or psychosis. And it's also occasionally used to treat other mental and physical health conditions like catatonia as well. And it tends to be reserved for situations when a person's health hasn't improved with other treatments. So usually with people would be offered talking therapies or medication before they'd be offered ECT. And ECT would be reserved for situations where those haven't worked or when they're life-threatening. For instance, when somebody's so dehydrated that they can't eat or drink and they're at risk of dying due to dehydration. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I think about 200 to 300 people will have ECT each year.
And the success rate for that?
It works pretty well. Studies show that 70 to 90% of people with severe depression who receive ECT experience an improvement in symptoms. And also this happens much faster than with medication. And people who have ECT also have lower death rates from all causes and improved quality of life.
What does he mean about having lower death rates from all causes?
When you're depressed, you tend to have a poor quality of life. You tend to eat more poorly, so you're more prone to a lot of other not just mental health conditions, but physical conditions, including heart disease. So the better treated your depression is, the more you can actually be active, be going on with your life, the less likely you are to develop those other medical issues as well. Now, response for any individual might be determined by a number of different things, including the type of mental health condition they've got, their age, and other factors. But researchers constantly kind of going on to improve ECT and people's response to it.
Does the stigma around it, let's talk one flew over the cuckoo's nest and people, biting on leather.
Just bite down.
Huh?
Now bite down on it.
Here we go.
If you say electroconvulsive therapy, it tends to conjure up an image of a grim Victorian institution torturing the mentally ill.
Does that make it difficult to reach patients who need the treatment?
Yeah, well, I mean, ECT remains a very stigmatized treatment for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think inaccurate and misleading depictions of ECT in the public arena, including film and television. You mentioned One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That was a classic example, and that leaves people with memories or images of people being strapped to beds and electrocuted, and that's highly inaccurate. ECT looks nothing like that. People these days who receive ECT will go to a theatre, an operating room, just as they would for any kind of surgical procedure. They'd receive general anesthetic that would put them to sleep, as well as a muscle relaxant that would stop any kind of unwanted movements. And they'll be fully asleep while the procedure is being undertaken.
ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, sends electric currents through the brain to essentially rewire the brain to better control mood and emotions. Those currents provoke a seizure. The seizure lasts less than a minute, but they are precious seconds, providing a burst of electrical activity.
And then they'll be woken up at the end and they won't remember or know anything about it, just how they feel afterwards.
They do have a seizure, right, during that procedure. That's part of it. What are the side effects of this?
So there are side effects of ECT. The most frequent ones being headache, which may be eased with Panadol, for instance, and nausea, which is usually secondary to the anesthetic rather than the ECT. And they can also have potential complications related to anesthesia, like cardiovascular and respiratory events. So they're usually screened for their safety to go to theatre before the procedure happens. And the one that most concerns people is memory loss or memory impairment.
We didn't realize that his whole memory was gone until after ECT was over. He doesn't know his parents. He doesn't know his siblings. He has no memory of our marriage, the birth of his children. Everything was wiped out of his mind.
And there are two types of this. There's anterograde memory changes, which mean the change in the ability to create new memories and recall recent events after the ECT is a transient phenomenon that usually returns to normal or maybe improved compared to pre-ECT levels within 2 to 4 weeks, because depression also affects your memory. And then retrograde memory changes, where autobiographical memories created before ECT are lost, can persist for weeks to months after ECT, and these may sometimes be permanently lost. And I think this is kind of what people mostly worry about. But these days, we know that the form of ECT has changed, and we titrate ECT to optimize a person's response to it, but also to minimize the chance of these sorts of side effects occurring.
ECT is normally not a one-off treatment. 8 to 12 treatments done 2 to 3 times a week are usually required, and they are free through the public health system.
And each session takes about 10 to 20 minutes. And it's, like I said, it's performed under general anesthesia in a theatre setting. Some people who have a good response to a block of ECT when they've not had a good response to other types of treatment may want to repeat a course of ECT from time to time when their mood goes down again. But for other people, one course is enough just to boost their mood enough for medications and talking therapies to actually start working.
How old? What is the age when you can first have it, or even at an age cutoff where you can't have it, where the brain just won't cope?
ECT can be done at any age. It has been done in children and young people, and I think out of the 200 to 300 people a year in the country who'd have it, I think there's been about 9 who'd have been under 18. Not usually in children, so it'd be mostly with adolescents with very severe depression, and it is as effective for adolescents as it is for adults. Usually, before it was undertaken for adolescents, there would be consultation with not just an ECT specialist, but also somebody who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist to make sure that both are in agreement that that is an appropriate treatment, that everything else has been tried, and that it's safe enough to undertake.
So when they come out of it, what's life like for them?
For most people, it's better. Like I said, for 70 to 90% of people with severe depression, they do experience an improvement in symptoms and functioning. I've certainly looked after people who've been through ECT and seen them return to doing things that they love doing that they weren't able to do for many months or years. And they have been very positive.
It just felt like there was a weight off my shoulder, and I went from thinking about suicide 20 to 30 times a day to maybe just fleeting thoughts once or twice every couple weeks. It's exciting to actually participate in life.
And I think there's a number of people who would have had ECT, who would have had good experiences, who may not necessarily talk publicly about having had it, but who would know that it has helped them.
Is there someone who can't have ECT, a depressed person who you just go, no, this is not appropriate?
So there would be situations in which I suppose somebody is medically fragile, or there might be risks which are usually more associated with the anesthetic than with the ECT, and they may not be considered suitable to go to theatre to have a general anesthetic and receive ECT. They would not be offered ECT.
What do you think is the biggest misconception surrounding ECT today?
Well, I think there's a number of misconceptions, but mostly I suppose that it's painful and that it causes brain damage, I guess, as we talked about. But like I said, on balance, it is an effective and safe treatment that can transform the lives of people with some mental health conditions when they're not responding to any other kind of treatment.
In New Zealand, has there been a bad case? Any reported cases of people who've really reacted badly to this?
I'm sure there are cases. I'm not personally aware of them, but there are cases, and there are ways in which kind of those adverse effects are monitored by services that are providing ECT. So just to clarify, I mean, ECT's changed over the years. It was undertaken at higher doses using, say, electrodes on both sides of the head. Now it's done at much lower doses with an electrode on one side of the head in most occasions. It's also done by psychiatrists who are trained in ECT and services that are accredited to provide ECT with nurses and anesthetists and a full ECT team that actually know how to do ECT well. So it's very different now to what it used to be. But having said that as well, ECT machines have been misused for non-evidence-based purposes. So at Lake Alex Hospital a few decades ago, they were used for correcting behavior.
We are sorry. That's from the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, who've apologised to survivors for the abuses at the Lake Alice Child and Adolescent Unit. Complaints emerged of sexual abuse, torture, painful injections and electric shocks, not as treatment, but as punishment.
Paul suffered dozens of electric shocks at Lake Alice.
The first time I couldn't believe what was hitting me, just like a hammer, just sheer pain.
In 1977, head psychiatrist Selwyn Lex justified the shock treatment like this.
It's effective, it's quick, it's life-saving, it has much to recommend it.
And this was never standard psychiatric treatment and never will be. And we would consider this a form of torture rather than a form of ECT.
Yeah, I read a woman had like hundreds of treatments to knock being a lesbian out of her. When you hear and see that, how damaging it is to what you guys are trying to do.
Yes, and I think that's the kind of thing that particularly gives ECT a bad rap and makes it harder for other people to trust that it does work. And it's awful that things like that have happened, to be honest.
There are calls, though, for it to be banned. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I would be very sad if it was banned, because I think for people who are very depressed, like I said, particularly those who are so depressed that they might become catatonic, as we would call it, and they're very still, they can't move, they can't even swallow or eat, and severe depression can do that to you. There's such a high risk of death for people like that, and if nothing else has worked for them, and ECT is not available, that would be very unfortunate. So I think that it definitely needs to be undertaken by people who are well trained in services that are accredited, and that they need to be good, safe procedures, as is the case right now. And as long as that's there all in place, then it should be a viable treatment that's on offer to people.
Are there enough qualified staff to do this, though? You know, does the stigma around it prevent people from putting their hand up to say, actually, I want to do this, I want to provide this treatment?
Yeah, so all psychiatrists are actually trained in doing ECT. I would have been as well. I mean, I was when I was a trainee. And we're trained to a basic standard to know how to do it and, you know, what the principles are, and to sort of watch people as they're undergoing, so we know what it's like for people to have ECT. Some psychiatrists do more specialist training to administer ECT, and they are doing ECT on a very regular basis, working in accredited services. So we do have workforce shortages around the country, which, as you'll be aware of in mental health services, which limit the ability to provide talking therapies and medications as well. So no doubt some of those shortages are might also affect the provision of ECT. But given that there's a very limited number of people who are doing the procedure in Aotearoa, New Zealand these days, and the services that they're working in are supportive of the treatment, currently I'm not aware that there are any difficulties in accessing ECT.
So there's no long waiting list or anything like that for people requiring it or wanting it?
Not that we've heard of at the College of Psychiatrists.
So do you provide this treatment yourself? Are you involved in giving this to patients?
I'm not these days, but during my training days, I worked with people who did it on a regular basis, who taught me how to do it, yes.
Doing it, just talk us through that experience. What's that like?
Well, I guess I had as much stigma as anyone else before seeing what this procedure was like. When I was a psychiatry trainee, I'd only heard the bad things in the press and media about it, rather than the good things. But I worked with an elderly gentleman who was very active, a runner who'd worked for many years of his life, you know, in a very high functioning capacity, who developed depression after his retirement, and he'd been struggling. He'd been doing talking therapy and receiving medication from the service I'd been working in for a couple of years, and as things were getting worse, then it looked like ECT could be a possible option. And I remember spending time discussing it with him and also supporting him through that process, and also seeing how he was afterwards. What I noticed was that, yes, it was a comfortable procedure. It was like going in, being put to sleep, just like I said, for any other surgical or dental procedure. And that when he came out, he did seem a bit groggy, a bit confused. He did have a few memory issues, which kind of were transient and kind of then passed. But afterwards, the improvement in his mood, the way he was brighter, the way he was more able to get back to things, and the thanks that he provided to our service, convinced me that actually, yes, this is something that can work for people. And I know that may not be the same result for everyone, but it did leave an impression.
I'm curious then, why did you not continue down that route? Was it just because of how you specialised, or is it something you'd look at redoing later in your career?
No, it's because of how I specialised. I work primarily with children and young people, so there's a much smaller number of young people who might be depressed enough to require ECT. Very few of them, but again, I have seen some in inpatient units that I've worked in who were coming in time and again, who were basically so depressed they couldn't go to school or work, and couldn't leave the house for many months, and nothing else was working to help them. And I've seen it be effective for them as well from a distance, although I've not been directly involved in their care.
He says research and work is constantly being done to advance and evolve ECT.
Yes, it already has in the last 50 years. It's changed considerably in terms, like I said, the way ECT is done, the doses that are used, and also not just the direct ECT treatment itself, but also the way anaesthetic kind of care is provided around the ECT to make it as comfortable and safe as possible.
Is it fully understood how and why it works?
No. That's the honest answer. We think it reverses some of the chemical and cellular changes that are associated with depression and those other mental health conditions I mentioned, but we don't fully understand how it works.
Just a curious one from me. If you don't have depression but you do have this treatment, what happens to you?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. It might be nothing, or you experience some of the side effects that I suppose people who have it do as well, in terms of some of those memory impairments. But that's a very good question. I'm sure somebody must have tried it, but I don't know.
That could be a podcast for another day, but today the focus is those who need it, some desperately.
Despite the stigma, ECT is a safe and effective treatment that can transform the lives of people. And if people are unsure, then ask more questions. It's worth asking and getting all the information before you make a decision, but also it's your decision and your finance decision as to whether you start and or continue this treatment.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Dr. Hiran Thabru. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and Davina Zimmer and engineered by Jeremy Ansell. I'm Amanda Gillies. Ngā te wā.